I was holding a gift bag in both hands when my son told me not to come. Not in those words. He never says things in those words. What he said was, "Mom, we're keeping it small this year." What he meant was, I didn't fit on the guest list of my own son's life anymore. I stood there in my kitchen, phone against my ear, tissue paper crinkling under my elbow, and I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I said, "All right, honey," and I hung up the phone, and I set the gift bag down on the counter very, very gently, like it might go off. I didn't cry. I just stood there. My name is Carol Ann Whitfield. I am 68 years old, and for 31 years I was a claims adjuster, which is a polite way of saying I spent 3 decades reading the fine print other people were too tired or too trusting to read themselves. I retired 4 years ago. My husband Frank died the year after that, quietly in his sleep, the way he did most things. And since then, my son Daniel has been the only family I have left who calls me on purpose instead of by accident. Tuesday came gray and steady, the way it does in early October, and that was the day the invitation didn't come. Renata's 10th anniversary dinner. Their 10th. I'd watched that marriage from the folding chairs at their courthouse wedding to the down payment on their first house. A down payment, I should mention, that came out of my late husband's pension the week after his funeral. Because that's what you do for family. That's what I thought family meant. Renata is Daniel's wife. She sells real estate now, does very well at it, and somewhere in the last few years she started referring to me, in front of other people, as Daniel's mother instead of Carol. As though I'd become a relation instead of a person. I want to tell you up front because it matters later. I don't hate my son. I never did, not for one single day of this. This isn't a story about hate. This is a story about a woman who spent 40 years being quiet, and one October where she finally stopped. That wasn't even the worst thing the two of them were hiding that week. For 11 years, Daniel and Renata have lived in a house on Larkspur Lane. A house I own the note on. Not the bank me. Frank and I structured it that way on purpose, back when interest rates made banks impossible for young couples, back when families still did things like that for each other without lawyers standing over their shoulders. $62,000 for percent, paid to me in a check on the first of every month for 11 years. It was never a gift. It was a private arrangement between people who trusted each other. I want you to remember that detail. It becomes important. I raised Daniel mostly alone during his father's 2 tours overseas, back when Frank was still in uniform, back before the pension and the claims job and the quiet Sunday dinners that became our whole relationship. I know how to run a household on nothing. I know how to make one income look like 2. That skill never left me. It just went quiet, the way a tool goes quiet in a drawer until the day you need it again. I want to tell you about 4 moments. For small ones. Because a woman doesn't wake up one Tuesday and decide to change a life. She collects the reasons first, one at a time, like receipts. The Christmas of 2017, Renata looked at the sweater I'd knitted for her and said, in front of both our families, "Oh, Carol, you really didn't have to make it homemade." She smiled when she said it. That's the part one remember most. The smile. The summer of 2019, at their pool, I overheard her tell a neighbor that I still dressed like it was 1994. And laughed the kind of laugh that isn't really about humor. The spring of 2022, Daniel called to cancel our standing Sunday dinner for the 9th week running. And when I asked gently if everything was all right, he said, "Mom, we're just really busy, you wouldn't understand." Which is a strange thing to say to a woman who once worked 2 jobs and raised him solo for 14 months at a time. And then this year, the 4th moment, the one that finally added itself up. Renata's mother was invited to a small family lunch at Larkspur Lane in August, and I was not. For moments. 5 years. That's not a bad day. That's a pattern, and once you see a pattern you can't unsee it, and once you can't unsee it, you start doing something worse than getting angry. You start paying attention. 2 weeks after that phone call about the anniversary dinner, I drove to Larkspur Lane myself. Not for the party. I wasn't invited to the party, but because I'd left my good casserole dish there in July and I wanted it back before the weather turned. I let myself in through the side door the way I've done for 11 years, the way any mother with a key to her own son's house might, and I heard voices in the kitchen before I saw anyone. Renata's voice first. She'll never actually push it. She never pushes anything. That's the whole point of her. Then Daniel's voice, lower, tired in a way that used to break my heart, and now just made me stand very still in the hallway. I know, but the loan on the house, Ren, if she ever decided to call that in, or even just, she won't. She's 68 and she cries over Hallmark commercials. Worst case, we tell her the market's soft. We push back the payoff conversation another year. She'll go along. She always goes along. There was more. There's always more. But that was the part that stayed lodged in me like a stone in a shoe. The sentence Renata said next, almost bored, almost kind in her cruelty. Once the restaurant loan clears next spring, we won't even need her cabin as collateral anymore. Then we can finally stop inviting her to things. It gets easier once she's not underfoot. I stood in that hallway holding an empty casserole dish, and I did not make a sound. I'm not angry. I'm simply done. That sentence arrived in my head fully formed, the way sentences sometimes do when a woman has finally run out of patience. She didn't know she was rationing. I want to pause here and tell you something my husband Frank used to say, because it's about to matter more than almost anything else in this story. Frank and I were married 39 years. He was not a romantic man in the way movies mean it. He never wrote poetry, never remembered anniversaries without a note taped to the fridge. But 6 months before he died, sitting on our back porch with his coffee going cold in his hand, he said something to me I didn't understand at the time, and have thought about nearly every day since. He said, "Carolyn, you have spent your whole life making yourself smaller so other people could feel bigger. When I'm gone, don't you dare keep doing that in your own house." I didn't cry when he said it. I laughed, actually, because it sounded so dramatic for a Tuesday afternoon. I laughed and told him he was being morbid, and he just looked at me the way he used to look at insurance forms he already knew were fraudulent, patient and certain, and not the least bit fooled. I understood what he meant standing in that hallway with an empty casserole dish. It only took me 4 years. If you've ever stood in a doorway and heard the people who are supposed to love you plan around the day you'll finally stop being useful to them, you already know the kind of cold, quiet stillness I mean. Stay with me. This is where it turns. I did not confront them that day. I put the casserole dish in my car. I drove home in complete silence with the radio off. And I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the way I used to sit down with claims files 30 years ago, looking for the clause nobody thought I'd read. The following Thursday, I called Marion Castellano. Marion was Frank's estate attorney for 11 years before he became mine, a small, sharp woman in her 70s who still comes into the office on Saturdays because, in her words, retirement is for people who don't enjoy winning. I told her everything. The loan on Larkspur Lane. The 11 years of payments. The overheard conversation. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer in a lawyer than you'd think, and when I finished, she said one sentence that settled something in my chest like a key turning in an old lock. "Carol, that loan has been carried informally for over a decade with no recorded note modification, which means, legally, you can call the balance due whenever you choose on 30 days' notice. You were never as unprotected as they think you are." I asked her, quietly, what that would actually mean, in practice, for a woman who just wanted to stop being invisible in her own family. She smiled. I could hear it in her voice, and said, "It means you're not the liability in this story, Carol. You're the only person in it who was ever holding all the paper." That wasn't even the worst thing they were about to find out. I want to be very clear about something, because it's easy to hear a story like this and assume the woman in it wants blood. I didn't. I wanted precisely one thing. For the people who had decided I was a soft, foolish, disposable old woman to discover, on their own timeline, exactly how much of their comfortable life had been quietly resting in my hands the entire time. Marion drew up the formal 30-day notice of loan maturity, a document calling the remaining principal balance on the Larkspur Lane note due in full, per the original 2013 agreement, which had always technically permitted early call with proper notice. $41,000 remaining, due in 30 days. No malice in the language. Just numbers, dates, and a signature line. Then I did something Marion did not draft for me. Something that was entirely mine. I went to the same little stationery shop where I used to buy Daniel's birthday cards when he was small, the kind with foil trim that he thought was the height of sophistication at age 9, and I bought a card that said, In gold script, "Happy 10th anniversary." Inside it, in my own handwriting, I wrote, "Renata and Daniel, I understand it's a small dinner this year, and I completely respect that. Please accept this gift instead. I believe you'll find it very informative reading. With love always, Mom." I folded the notice of loan maturity in half, tucked it inside the card, sealed the envelope, and mailed it certified, so there would be a signature confirming exactly when it landed in their hands. That was my gift. Not a toaster. Not a check. The truth, delivered on their own anniversary, in an envelope with a bow-shaped stamp, arriving exactly on time. Wednesday, they signed for it at 10:14 in the morning, according to the tracking number Marion forwarded me. I know because my phone did not stop after that. Daniel at 11:02. "Mom, can you call me? I think there's been some kind of mistake with a letter we got." Renata at 11:40. "Carol, I really think we should discuss this like adults before anyone does anything rash." Daniel at 1:15. "Mom, seriously, this isn't funny, call me back." Daniel at 3:30. "Mom, please." Renata's mother at 4:02. A woman I have met exactly 6 times in 11 years, texting me directly for the first time ever. "I hope you understand what you're doing to this family." Daniel at 6:45, a voicemail this time, his voice doing the thing it used to do as a boy when he'd broken something and hadn't figured out yet how to say so. "Mom, it's me again. Look, I don't understand why you'd do something like this out of nowhere. We've never even been late on a payment. This feels like it's coming out of left field. Just call me. Please. Whatever's going on, we can fix it." Nowhere. That was the word that stayed with me longest. Out of nowhere. As if 11 years of quiet payments and quieter exclusions hadn't been leading, calmly and specifically, to exactly this Wednesday. Renata at 9:20 that night. Her voice gone tight and fast in a way I'd never once heard it in 11 years of knowing her. "Carol, I need you to understand something. If this loan comes due, we cannot refinance in 30 days, not with the restaurant financing already in underwriting. This could cost Daniel everything he's built. I really think you need to reconsider before you do something you'll regret." I did not call back that night. I watered my ferns. I made a cup of tea. I sat on my own back porch, the one Frank built with his own hands the summer Daniel turned 12, and I let the phone buzz itself quiet on the table beside me. And that wasn't even the worst thing the debt was tied to. The following morning, Marion called with something Renata's own financing paperwork had accidentally made public in the underwriting process. A detail Marion's contact at the title company mentioned almost in passing, the way small, devastating facts often arrive. The restaurant loan Renata was counting on required Larkspur Lane listed as collateral, which meant if my note came due and they couldn't refinance in time, the house itself, the house 11 years of quiet trust had built, would be at risk in the very transaction they'd been so certain I'd never notice. They had gambled my patience against their ambition, and they had done the math wrong. Daniel showed up at my door on a Saturday morning, for days after the anniversary he hadn't invited me to. He looked like he hadn't slept, which I understood, because I hadn't slept especially well myself, though for entirely different reasons. He didn't yell. My son has never once raised his voice at me in 39 years, and he didn't start that morning either. He stood on my porch, in the same gray light Frank used to drink his coffee in, and he said, "Mom, why didn't you just tell me you were upset? Why would you do it like this?" I let the question sit in the air a moment before I answered it, because I have learned something in 68 years that I wish someone had taught me at 30. Silence is not empty. Silence is where the other person hears themselves for the first time. "How many Sundays did you cancel on me this year, Daniel?" He didn't answer. How many times did Renata correct someone who called me by my name instead of Daniel's mother? He looked at the porch boards. "How much rent have I ever asked either of you to pay me, in 11 years, on a house I hold the note to myself?" "Mom, that's not, it was never about. I heard you in your own kitchen, Daniel. Both of you. I heard exactly what it was about." His face did something then I hadn't seen since he was 9 years old, and got caught in a much smaller lie. Something folded in on itself. "Mom, I'm sorry. We shouldn't have said any of that. I don't know why we said it. It was a bad day, it wasn't. An apology for getting caught isn't an apology, Daniel. It's a negotiation. You're not sorry for what you said in that kitchen. You're sorry I heard it. He stood there a long moment, and to his credit, and I will give him this credit, because he has always, underneath everything, been a decent man who married someone sharper and colder than he ever learned to be. He didn't try to argue the point. What do you want, Mom? Tell me what you want and I'll do it. I told him the truth, because by that point there was no reason left not to. I told him I didn't want the house. I didn't want the loan repaid early out of spite, and I didn't want to punish a marriage I'd once stood up in a courthouse to witness. What I wanted was much smaller, and much larger than that. I want to be invited to dinner because you want me there, Daniel. Not tolerated. Not managed. Not planned around like a liability on a spreadsheet. If that's not something the two of you are capable of, then I would rather hold the paper on that house until it's paid off fair and square, on the original terms, and see each other twice a year at holidays like distant cousins. Either one is fine with me now. I'm not afraid of either outcome anymore. That's the part you and Renata never accounted for. I did extend Marion's office to renegotiate the 30-day call back into the original monthly schedule. Same 4%, same 11 years remaining, nothing punitive, nothing designed to hurt them financially. I want to be honest about that, because this was never meant to be a story about ruin. It was a story about being seen. But there was one thing I did not renegotiate, and would not. 8-year-old Mia, my granddaughter, Daniel and Renata's only child. The one bright spot who has never once in her short life spoken to me the way her mother sometimes does. Had a small trust account I'd opened the week she was born, funded quietly out of Frank's pension every single month since. Renata, in the panic of that week, had asked through Daniel whether that account might be redirected to help cover the restaurant shortfall, just until things stabilized. I said no. Calmly and completely, and only once. That money was never about you or Renata. I told Daniel. That's Mia's. It stays exactly where it is, growing exactly the way her grandfather and I intended. And it comes to her at 18 no matter what happens between the rest of us. Some things in this family are not up for negotiation, and that is one of them. I saw something in Daniel's face when I said it. Not anger, but a kind of quiet respect I hadn't seen directed at me in years. As if some part of him understood, watching me hold that single line, that I was not doing any of this out of cruelty. I was doing it because I had finally, at 68, learned the difference between generosity and being used, and I intended to keep practicing the difference for whatever years I had left. 3 months later, on a Sunday that nobody had to cancel, I sat at Daniel and Renata's table for dinner. Renata made the pot roast herself this time, not catered, and she didn't correct anyone who called me Carol. Mia sat beside me and asked, halfway through dessert, in the blunt and wonderful way that only children manage, "Grandma, is it true you almost made Mom and Dad sell the house?" I looked at her, and I looked at her parents, who both went very still waiting to hear how I'd answer. "No, sweetheart," I said. "I just reminded everyone whose name was actually on the paper." Renata laughed, a real laugh, not the kind from the pool party years ago. And after a moment, so did Daniel. I never did throw away the letter Daniel eventually wrote me. The long one. The one where he apologized properly this time, in the right order, for the years and not just the consequences. It's in the top drawer of my desk, next to a stack of Frank's old letters from his years overseas. In the box I keep the things that matter in. Not the trash. The drawer. There's a difference, and I've learned people show you which one they intend for you long before they ever write the words down. I still hold the note on Larkspur Lane. 11 years running, for percent, paid on the 1st of every month, same as it's always been. But something else arrives now that never used to. A Sunday phone call that isn't about anything in particular. An invitation that comes 2 weeks early instead of not at all. A granddaughter who knows, without anyone explaining it to her twice, that her grandmother is not a liability to be managed but a woman whose name was on the paper the entire time. I think about Frank often, especially on the porch he built, especially when the light goes that particular gray it goes in October. I think about the thing he told me 6 months before he died, about not making myself small in my own house anymore. I like to believe, wherever he is, he'd have found some quiet, private satisfaction in the fact that it only took me 4 years, 1 certified letter, And a very informative anniversary gift to finally learn how to take up the space he always insisted I deserved. I'm not angry anymore. I never really was, not underneath it. I was simply done being underfoot in my own family. And that's not cruelty. That's honesty with a handle. I closed my notebook that Sunday night the way I close it most nights now. One line, in my own hand, nothing more. And it read. She finally understood the paperwork was never the weapon. It was just the proof she'd been there the whole time. And I slept the way a woman sleeps when she finally stops asking permission to matter in her own life.